Okay, so the Supreme Court just delivered what could be the most brutal ultimatum ever issued to a sitting president in modern American history. We're talking about a direct order from the highest court in the land that essentially says, comply with our ruling or face potential contempt proceedings that could lead to imprisonment. This isn't political theater. This isn't cable news hysteria. This is a full-blown constitutional crisis unfolding in real time, and the White House is absolutely scrambling right now because they have no good options left on the table. Before we get into the absolute chaos this has created, I need to be straight with you about something. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're going to spin this 100 different ways, depending on which corporate interests are writing their checks. That's why we built US Power Alert, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's actually happening in Washington before everyone else is talking about it, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, breaking down the power plays, the institutional battles, and the behind-the-scenes moves that actually matter. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth and isn't afraid to call out power when it abuses its authority, this is your moment. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below telling us what you think about this Supreme Court ultimatum. Is this the check on executive power that America needs? Or is this judicial overreach? We want to hear from you. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. The Supreme Court issued a ruling 3 weeks ago in a case involving Trump's use of emergency powers to redirect military construction funds toward a massive deportation infrastructure project. The court ruled 7-2 that the administration's reallocation of approximately $18 billion in already appropriated defense funds violated both the Appropriations Clause and explicit congressional directives on how those funds were to be spent. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Roberts and joined by Justices Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, Barrett, Jackson, and Sotomayor, was absolutely scathing. Roberts wrote that the executive branch cannot simply ignore congressional appropriations when those appropriations conflict with presidential priorities, no matter how strongly the president feels about border security or immigration enforcement. The court gave the administration 14 days to halt all construction using the redirected funds and to return control of those appropriations to the Department of Defense for their congressionally mandated purposes. That 14-day deadline passed 4 days ago, and the Trump administration did not comply. Instead, the White House issued a statement saying they were reviewing their legal options and that construction would continue during that review period. The Department of Homeland Security sent a memo to contractors saying that work should proceed as planned. And President Trump himself went on social media saying that the court's ruling was an example of judicial activism that undermines national security and that he had taken an oath to protect the American people, not to follow orders from unelected judges. That response triggered an emergency session at the Supreme Court yesterday. And this is where things went from bad to absolutely catastrophic for the White House. The court issued what's called an order to show cause, which is essentially the judicial system saying, you need to appear before us immediately and explain why you shouldn't be held in contempt for defying our ruling. The order was signed by 8 justices. Only Justice Alito dissented, writing that while he disagreed with the administration's defiance, he believed contempt proceedings against a sitting president raised separation of powers issues that required more deliberation. But 8 justices, including 3 Trump appointees, signed an order that reads like something you'd see in a banana republic, not the United States of America. The court gave the administration 72 hours to appear and show cause why senior administration officials, potentially including the president himself, should not be held in contempt. And here's the absolutely stunning part. The order explicitly states that contempt of the Supreme Court can carry criminal penalties, including imprisonment, and that no person, not even the president, is above the law or immune from the court's authority to enforce its rulings. The White House is in absolute meltdown mode right now. According to sources inside the administration who spoke on condition of anonymity, because they're not authorized to discuss internal deliberations, there was an emergency meeting in the Oval Office last night that went past midnight. The president was reportedly furious, calling the court's order a coup, an attack on the presidency, and an attempt by the judicial establishment to overturn the will of the voters. Senior advisors were divided. Some were urging immediate compliance to avoid a constitutional crisis that could paralyze the presidency. Others were pushing for defiance, arguing that if Trump backs down now, he'll spend the rest of his term fighting orders from judges in every district court in America. The White House counsel's office is apparently in chaos, with multiple lawyers threatening to resign if the president refuses to comply, because they don't want their names attached to what would be the first contempt of court case against a sitting president in American history. And here's the problem. This isn't just about border security or immigration policy. This is about whether the President of the United States is bound by Supreme Court rulings, or whether the President can simply ignore judicial orders when he disagrees with them. And if the answer is that presidents can ignore the courts, then we don't really have a separation of powers anymore. We have an elected monarch who does whatever he wants and treats the other two branches of government as suggestions rather than constraints. Let me explain the legal mechanism at play here, because this is absolutely critical to understanding why this is such a massive deal. The Appropriations Clause of the Constitution is one of the most fundamental checks on executive power. It says that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except in consequence of appropriations made by law. What that means in plain English is that Congress controls the purse. The president cannot spend money that Congress hasn't authorized him to spend, and he cannot redirect money that Congress has already allocated for specific purposes. This was one of the key lessons the founders took from British history, where kings would tax and spend without parliamentary approval, leading to tyranny and revolution. The founders said never again. In America, elected representatives control the money, not the executive. Now, presidents have tested the boundaries of this clause throughout American history. Richard Nixon tried to impound funds that Congress had appropriated for programs he didn't like. The Supreme Court ruled that was illegal, and Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act to make sure no future president could try it again. Ronald Reagan redirected some funds in the name of national security, but he did it with at least some plausible statutory authority, and he never directly defied a court order to stop. George W. Bush pushed the boundaries with signing statements and creative interpretations of emergency powers. But again, he never flat out refused to comply with the Supreme Court ruling. Barack Obama faced similar issues with immigration enforcement and also complied with judicial orders, even when he disagreed with them. This case with Trump is different because the court has already ruled, the administration has already been ordered to stop, and the president is saying no. The specific statute at issue is 10 U.S.C., Section 2808, which allows the president to use military construction funds in a declared emergency, but only for projects that directly support the use of the armed forces. Trump declared a national emergency at the border and argued that deportation infrastructure supports military operations. But here's the key problem. Congress explicitly denied his request for border wall and deportation facility funding in the regular appropriations process. When Congress says no to a funding request, the president cannot use emergency powers to get around that no. That's what the Supreme Court said 3 weeks ago. The majority opinion was very clear. Emergency powers are not a blank check to circumvent congressional control of the purse. If a president can declare any policy priority an emergency and then redirect funds to achieve that priority over congressional objections, then the Appropriations Clause becomes meaningless. So the Supreme Court ruled that the administration had to stop using those funds and return them to the Department of Defense. And the administration didn't comply. That triggered this order to show cause. And now we're in completely uncharted territory. Because what happens if the president continues to refuse? Okay, let's break down what this actually means across multiple dimensions. Because this isn't just a legal crisis. This is an institutional crisis, a political crisis, and potentially an international crisis, depending on how this plays out over the next few weeks. First, understand that the Supreme Court has the constitutional authority to enforce its rulings. This isn't some abstract power. The court can issue orders, and if those orders are defied, the court can hold individuals in contempt. Contempt of court is a serious matter. It can be civil contempt, which means you get fined or coerced into compliance. or it can be criminal contempt, which means you can be prosecuted and potentially jailed for refusing to follow a court order. The court's order yesterday made it clear that both types of contempt are on the table. The question is, who gets held in contempt? The administration is arguing that you cannot hold a sitting president in contempt because the president has immunity from prosecution while in office. But that argument is deeply problematic for several reasons. First, the Supreme Court has never recognized absolute presidential immunity from judicial orders. The court's most famous ruling on presidential power, United States v. Nixon in 1974, explicitly said that the president is not above the law and must comply with judicial process. Nixon tried to resist a subpoena for the Watergate tapes, arguing executive privilege. The court said no, you have to turn them over, and Nixon complied. If Nixon had refused, the court could have held him in contempt. Second, even if you believe that a sitting president cannot be criminally prosecuted while in office, which is a Justice Department policy, but not a constitutional requirement, that doesn't mean the president can ignore court orders. The court can still find the president in contempt, refer the matter to Congress for impeachment, or direct enforcement actions against specific executive branch officials who are carrying out the president's defiant orders. And that's exactly what legal experts are saying is about to happen. Second, this creates a separation of powers crisis that goes beyond this specific case. If Trump refuses to comply and the Supreme Court backs down, that sets a precedent that presidents can ignore judicial rulings they don't like. Every future president, Republican or Democrat, will point to this moment and say, well, Trump ignored the court and nothing happened, so I can ignore this district court ruling I don't like, or this appellate court decision that goes against my policy. The entire system of checks and balances depends on all three branches, respecting the authority of the other branches within their proper spheres. The judiciary's sphere is interpreting the law and the Constitution. If the executive can simply ignore judicial interpretations, then the judiciary becomes advisory rather than co-equal. We stop being a nation of laws and become a nation of presidential discretion. And that should terrify anyone who cares about constitutional government, regardless of whether you support Trump's policies. Third, this has massive political implications heading into the 2026 midterms and beyond. Republicans in Congress are absolutely torn right now. MAGA Republicans are rallying behind Trump, saying the Supreme Court is overstepping and trying to sabotage his presidency. Moderate Republicans, especially those in swing districts, are privately freaking out because they know this looks terrible. You cannot run on law and order, on respecting institutions, on judicial nominees, and then turn around and support a president who's defying the Supreme Court. Democrats are seizing on this as proof that Trump is a wannabe authoritarian who doesn't respect the rule of law. They're already drafting articles of impeachment based on contempt of court, arguing that defying a Supreme Court order is a high crime and misdemeanor. The political calculation for Republicans is brutal. If they support Trump, they look like they're endorsing lawlessness and undermining the Supreme Court, including justices they confirmed. If they break with Trump, they face primary challenges from MAGA candidates and risk losing their base. There's no good option politically, which is why you're seeing a lot of Republican senators suddenly become very unavailable for comment. Fourth, this has international implications that are just starting to become clear. America's credibility on the world stage depends in large part on the perception that we are a nation governed by law, not by the whims of whoever happens to be president. When the United States criticizes other countries for not respecting judicial independence or for leaders who defy court orders, we point to our own system as the model. We say, look, even our presidents have to follow court rulings. That's what makes us different from authoritarian regimes. If Trump successfully defies the Supreme Court and faces no consequences, that narrative collapses. Allies are watching this very carefully. European leaders are already expressing private concerns that America's constitutional system is breaking down. Ukrainian officials, who depend on American military and financial support, are worried that if Trump can redirect military funds without congressional approval, then future military aid commitments might not be reliable. NATO allies are questioning whether treaty obligations will be honored if a president decides he has emergency powers that override congressional constraints. And adversaries like Russia and China are absolutely loving this. State media in Moscow and Beijing are running stories about how American democracy is in crisis, how the rule of law in the United States is collapsing, and how this proves that the American model of government is fundamentally unstable. This isn't just about domestic politics. This is about America's role in the world and whether our system of government is seen as stable and reliable. Fifth, there's a massive economic dimension that's not getting enough attention. Markets hate uncertainty, and a constitutional crisis where the president is defying the Supreme Court is uncertainty on steroids. Investors need to know that contracts will be enforced, that property rights will be respected, that the rule of law is predictable. If the president can ignore Supreme Court rulings, what does that mean for contract disputes that end up in federal court? What does that mean for regulatory decisions that get appealed to the judiciary? What does that mean for business planning when legal rulings can apparently just be ignored if the president doesn't like them? We're already seeing some volatility in bond markets because investors are worried about the stability of American institutions. If this escalates, if the contempt proceedings move forward, and the administration continues to defy the court, you could see serious capital flight as investors decide that American rule of law is no longer reliable. That sounds dramatic, but this is the kind of institutional breakdown that causes long-term economic damage, because it undermines the legal foundations that markets depend on. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because the 72-hour clock is ticking, and the White House has to make a decision very soon. There are really only a few possible outcomes here, and none of them are great for Trump. The first scenario is that the administration complies. They halt construction, they return the funds to the Department of Defense, they file the required compliance reports with the court, and they move on. This would be the smart play legally and institutionally. It would avoid a contempt finding, it would preserve the court's authority, and it would allow the administration to fight this battle through legislation rather than through defiance. But politically, it would be seen as a massive defeat. Trump would look weak, his base would be furious, and every future conflict with judges would embolden those judges to issue more orders, knowing that Trump will eventually back down. So there are powerful political incentives for Trump not to comply, even though compliance is the right legal move. The second scenario is that the administration shows up at the Supreme Court hearing, but argues that the president cannot be held in contempt because of presidential immunity, and that therefore the court should direct any enforcement actions at subordinate officials rather than at the president himself. This is a middle ground strategy that tries to preserve Trump's image while throwing senior officials under the bus. The problem with this approach is that it still requires the administration to eventually comply with the court's underlying ruling, and it opens up senior officials like the Secretary of Homeland Security or White House Chief of Staff to personal liability. Those officials are not going to be happy about being sacrificed to protect Trump's political brand, and you can expect resignations and leaks if that's the path the administration chooses. The third scenario is that the administration refuses to comply and also refuses to appear at the show cause hearing, essentially daring the Supreme Court to enforce its orders. This would be the most confrontational approach, and it would precipitate a full constitutional crisis. The court would likely find the administration in contempt, refer the matter to the Justice Department for prosecution, and also refer the matter to Congress for impeachment. The Justice Department is technically part of the executive branch, so it's unclear whether the Attorney General would actually prosecute contempt charges against his own president. But if the Attorney General refuses, that could trigger a crisis within the Justice Department, with career prosecutors potentially resigning in protest or the Attorney General facing impeachment himself. And if this goes to Congress, House Democrats will absolutely impeach Trump for contempt of court. The question is whether Senate Republicans would vote to convict. Based on the current math, you'd need 17 Republicans to join all 50 Democrats to reach the 67 votes needed for conviction. That seems unlikely right now. But if this crisis drags on and more facts come out about the administration's defiance, those numbers could shift. Senators hate being put in a position where they have to choose between their oath to the Constitution and their political survival. And this contempt situation would force exactly that choice. The fourth scenario, and this is the one that nobody really wants to talk about, but that legal scholars are quietly discussing, is that the Supreme Court finds Trump in contempt, and when the Justice Department refuses to enforce it, the court takes the extraordinary step of appointing a special prosecutor or directing the U.S. Marshal Service to enforce the contempt order. The Marshal Service is part of the Justice Department, but they also have a traditional role as the enforcement arm of the federal judiciary. Historically, U.S. Marshals have been used to enforce desegregation orders, to protect judges, and to execute court orders, even when the executive branch was reluctant. If the Supreme Court orders the marshals to halt construction, and the president orders the marshals to stand down, you have a direct conflict of authority that could escalate very quickly. And if marshals show up at construction sites, and contractors are caught between following a Supreme Court order and following executive branch directives, you have the potential for physical confrontations that could make this crisis very visible and very ugly. There's also a fifth scenario that some in the administration are apparently pushing, which is to ask Congress to pass emergency legislation that retroactively authorizes the use of the funds, essentially mooting the Supreme Court's ruling. But that requires Congress to act, and right now Congress is deeply divided. House Republicans might be able to pass something, but Senate Democrats and moderate Republicans are unlikely to bail out Trump after he's defied the court. And even if Congress did pass such legislation, it would take weeks or months, and it wouldn't address the underlying contempt issue because Trump already defied a court order. You can't unring that bell legislatively. So here's what to watch in the coming days. First, watch for the White House response to the show cause order. Do they file a brief arguing presidential immunity? Do they request more time? Do they signal any willingness to comply? The brief is due in less than 72 hours, so we'll know very soon what legal strategy they're pursuing. Second, watch for movement inside the Republican caucus in Congress. Are senior Republicans like Mitch McConnell or Senate Judiciary Committee members making any public statements about the importance of respecting Supreme Court authority? If you start seeing Republicans distance themselves from Trump on this issue, that's a sign that they think defiance is politically unsustainable. Third, watch for resignations or leaks from inside the administration. If senior Justice Department officials, White House counsels, office lawyers, or cabinet members start leaving, that's a sign that people don't want to be associated with what comes next. Fourth, watch for market reactions. If bond yields spike or if you see significant movement in currency markets, that's investors pricing in institutional instability. And fifth, watch for international reactions, especially from allies. If you start seeing European leaders or NATO officials making public statements about the importance of rule of law, that's a sign that this is damaging American credibility in ways that go beyond domestic politics. The bottom line here is that we are watching a constitutional crisis unfold in slow motion. The Supreme Court has given the president a direct order. The president has refused to comply. And now, the court is threatening contempt proceedings that could lead to criminal penalties. This isn't a hypothetical scenario from a political science textbook. This is happening right now, in real time. And how this plays out over the next few weeks could define the relationship between the executive and judicial branches for a generation. If Trump successfully defies the court and faces no real consequences, that fundamentally changes what it means to have an independent judiciary and a separation of powers. If the court holds Trump in contempt, and that triggers impeachment or criminal proceedings, we're in uncharted constitutional territory with no clear roadmap for how this ends. Either way, the presidency will never be quite the same after this. The question is whether the rest of our constitutional system survives intact, or whether this is the moment when we look back and say, that's when things broke. Stay tuned because this story is far from over, and what happens next could reshape American government in ways we can't even fully predict yet. Keep your eyes on the Supreme Court, keep your eyes on Congress, and keep your eyes on how the American people react when they realize that we're in the middle of the most serious constitutional crisis since Watergate. This is history happening in real time, and every single day matters.